Welcome to the deep dive. You know how we do things here? We take one amazing piece of writing and we just totally, completely geek out on it. And today, it's all about intersectional identity. You ever feel like all the different parts of who you are, like, I don't know, kind of bump into each other, overlap in ways you don't
It's
expect?
just like a puzzle, right? All these unique pieces fitting together to make you, you.
Yeah, exactly. And our guide for this deep dive is Raymond Mulari's Autobiography. Now, this isn't your typical autobiography. He wrote it for a course at Drexel University, something called Educational Leadership of Equity and Social Justice. So it's personal, yeah, but he's also thinking about these huge societal structures, too.
It's really powerful how he weaves those two things together,
Yeah,
using his own story to examine these larger systems of power and inequality.
totally. And Mulari's story is anything but simple. I mean, he identifies as Filipino, immigrant, gay, musician, caregiver. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Oh, for sure. And that's what makes this so fascinating. We're going to see how all these different parts of his identity have shaped his experiences, his whole worldview.
It was like looking through a kaleidoscope, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And one concept we're going to see pop up a lot is this idea of positionality. It's a fancy word, but basically it means that our unique combination of identities influences how we see and interact with the world around us. It's like a lens.
I love that. And, it's so true. Like, we can't escape our own experiences, right? They shape how we understand everything. And Malari actually starts his story by talking about coming to America from the Philippines when he was only 5 years old. Think about that for a second. Trying to navigate a whole new culture, learn English at that age.
It's a lot to process for anyone, let alone a 5-year-old. Those early experiences can really have a lasting impact on our sense of self.
For sure. And Mallory talks about struggling with English, feeling self-conscious, and often being mistaken for other ethnicities. He even mentions people calling him Chinese boy or Bruce Lee, even though he's Filipino.
Yeah, it highlights how readily we categorize people based on appearance. We make assumptions that can be hurtful or even erase someone's true identity. It's like these microaggressions, they may seem small on the surface, but they build up over time, and they contribute to this feeling of not belonging.
It makes you wonder, right? Like, how many of us go through life feeling like we have to fit into these boxes that society creates for us? Like, this is what it means to be this or that.
And when you're navigating multiple cultural influences, that pressure to conform can be even stronger. It's like, which box do I belong in? Do I even fit?
Mallory actually shares some pretty funny anecdotes about adjusting to American food. Like, he was totally bewildered by the idea of putting milk on cereal. He called it cow juice and thought cereal was some kind of mystery material.
It's funny, right? But it also points to a deeper truth about how cultural norms shape our perceptions of even the most basic things. What we consider normal or strange is often just relative to our own background. But beyond the humor, you have to think about that. Having to relearn these seemingly basic things, it can be so isolating.
Totally. And all of this is happening while his family is separated because of immigration challenges. His parents actually had to move to Virginia first, leaving him and his brothers behind in the Philippines for a time.
That's something we don't talk about enough. The emotional toll of family separation. It's a huge burden for children and families to bear. And I think it makes you wonder about the long-term impact.
Right.
The impact on Malari's sense of belonging, his sense of stability.
It definitely sets the stage for understanding some of the challenges he faces later on, that's for sure. And speaking of challenges, here's where things get really interesting. Malari's experience coming out as gay in the early days of the internet. Think, AOL chat rooms were all the rage back then, and that's where he found his community.
Oh, yeah. It was a different world, wasn't it? But it shows you how technology can create these spaces for connection, especially for people who might feel marginalized or isolated in their offline lives.
He calls it his not coming out story. Basically, he was out online, but not to his family.
It really speaks to the complexities of coming out, especially back then. Societal acceptance of LGBTQ plus individuals was so different then. It was a different time.
Oh, definitely. And it's interesting because even though same-sex marriage is legal now, Malari still talks about this lingering fear of homophobia. He actually avoids holding hands with his husband in public because he's worried about, negative reactions.
It's a reminder that legal progress doesn't necessarily erase prejudice, right? That internalized fear that he describes is a reality for so many people in the LGBTQ plus community. It shows how deeply personal these experiences are, and how they continue to shape people's choices even today.
It's heartbreaking, but also so real. And just when his life seems to be settling, another layer gets added. He's a musician, which we've talked about, but he's also a caregiver for his paralyzed mother-in-law. It's a lot to juggle.
Absolutely. And let's be real, the financial strain of being both an artist and a caregiver is immense. I mean, he mentions never making over 40K a year, so.
Yeah. And it's like he's navigating these multiple demanding roles,
Hmm.
often with very limited resources. It's a story that I think a lot of people can relate to in different ways.
For sure. And it makes you think about the bigger picture, like how do we support individuals who are juggling all these different roles and responsibilities? How do we create a society that values caregiving and also supports the arts? It's complicated.
So we're starting to see all these different threads of Malari's identity coming together, creating challenges, but also these unique perspectives. It's like a tapestry, right? But the question is, how does he make sense of it all? How does he use these experiences to inform his academic work and ultimately his vision for leadership? That's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
So we know Malari's personal experiences are, well, pretty diverse. But I'm curious, how does he analyze those experiences through an academic lens? How does he tie it all together?
Okay, so this is where things get really, really fascinating. Like, buckle up, folks. Malari takes a deep dive, see what I did there, a deep dive into how certain theoretical frameworks, like critical theory or structural functionalism, even queer theory and Asian crit theory can sometimes fall short. Like when you try to apply them to music education and performance, he's not afraid to challenge those big ideas that, using his own life as a lens.
That's pretty bold, especially for someone in academia. You don't often see people pushing back against those established theories. So can you give us a specific example, like how he critiques one of these frameworks?
He's super passionate about the limitations of critical theory when you try to apply it to music education. He gets it, he sees the value, but he argues that it can oversimplify things, The power dynamics in the music world are so complex and nuanced. And he uses a really interesting example. He says the traditional emphasis on technical proficiency, hitting all the right notes, can overshadow these crucial conversations about equity and social justice.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's like the focus on playing it perfectly can drown out the voices of those who are struggling to even get a seat at the table, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, are we so focused on the mechanics that we're missing the bigger picture? And he doesn't stop there. He also critiques, like, the whole hierarchical structure of orchestras, the conductor at the top calling all the shots.
Right, the traditional maestro figure.
Exactly. He argues that that kind of top-down approach can just perpetuate existing power imbalances. I mean, especially when you think about it historically, right? The dominance of white, heterosexual male conductors in classical music.
Yeah.
It's a problem.
That ties in perfectly with queer theory, the whole idea of disrupting those traditional power structures and norms that exclude certain groups. It sounds like Malari's pushing for a more democratic and inclusive approach to music, one that values everyone's experiences and perspectives, not just the ones who have traditionally held the power.
100%. And he's not afraid to point out gaps in scholarship either. He even mentions that Asian crit theory, which focuses on the experiences of Asian and Pacific Islander communities, is the least developed and least applied to education. Like, out of all the race-based critical theories, that's a big statement.
And it speaks to a bigger issue, doesn't it? The lack of representation in academia can really perpetuate this cycle of exclusion, where certain voices and perspectives are just overlooked.
But here's the thing. Malari isn't just critiquing to be critical. He's using his unique positionality, his experiences as a Filipino, immigrant, gay, musician, and caregiver to advocate for actual, tangible change in the classical music world.
He's not just pointing fingers, he's offering solutions.
Right. He's actually walking the walk. He even mentions organizations like the International Pride Orchestra and the Philadelphia Freedom Band, which are working to diversify the classical music landscape. Making it more inclusive, more representative.
It's amazing how music can be this powerful tool for social change, right? These organizations are challenging the status quo, creating spaces where everyone feels welcome. It's about more than just the music.
It's about community, about belonging, about breaking down barriers.
Oh, yeah.
And it all comes back to leadership. How does Malari envision using these experiences, his academic insights, to lead others? That's the big question. Okay, so let's recap for a second. We've talked about Raymond Malari's journey as a Filipino immigrant, about him coming out in the early days of, AOL chat rooms and how he balances being a musician with being a caregiver for his mother-in-law. It's a lot.
And on top of all that, we've talked about how he uses those experiences to look critically at all those social justice frameworks, especially in the world of music.
And he's not just critiquing them, right?
Mm-hmm.
He actually wants to use his unique perspective to make a difference.
To create change.
To create change, exactly. And that brings us to leadership. Like, how does he see himself as a leader? What kind of change does he want to see in the world?
Yeah, like, what's his vision?
Well, he's really drawn to the idea of leading through mentorship and collaboration, like creating spaces where diverse voices are not just, allowed, but actually encouraged and amplified.
That's so important.
Right. It's not about him being the one at the top with all the answers. It's about empowering others to share their own perspectives and talents.
It's a totally different approach to leadership, especially in fields like classical music, which has always been so traditional.
Yeah. Very hierarchical.
Oh.
And it's not just about these abstract ideas. He actually talks about specific organizations that are doing this work, like the International Pride Orchestra, the Queer Urban Orchestra, the Philadelphia Freedom Band.
Putting it into practice.
Putting it into practice, yeah. They're pushing boundaries, making the classical music scene more inclusive, more representative of, the real world.
And it's not just about performing. He mentions wanting to go for his doctorate in education, focusing on creativity and innovation. It's like he wants to take his passion for music, his commitment to social justice, and use it to develop new ways of teaching.
New approaches that put inclusivity and equity at the center.
Yeah.
It's really amazing to see how he's using all the different parts of himself, like all these threads of his identity, his experiences, his knowledge, and weaving them together to make the world a better place. It's pretty inspiring.
It is.
And it makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About your own story. What makes you you? What experiences and perspectives do you bring to the table?
What makes you unique?
Right. What makes you unique? And how can you use that? How can you use your own unique positionality to be a better leader, to make a difference in your own way?
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves.
Yeah.
Because we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable future.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Raymond Mulari's story,
All right, we're diving into something really important today.
Okay.
It's about how race and culture can really affect research, especially in education.
Yeah, it's a big one.
We're looking at this article by H. Richard Milner V.
Okay.
It's called Race, Culture, and Researcher Positionality, Working Through Dangers Seen, Unseen, and Unforeseen.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Right. It's a real eye-opener, this article.
I bet.
Basically, we're going to uncover these pitfalls, that researchers can fall into if they don't think carefully about race and culture.
Yeah, makes sense.
And the cool thing is, Milner gives us this framework
Cool.
to help researchers navigate all this.
That's helpful, I'm sure.
It is. It's fascinating stuff.
Sometimes these influences are so subtle,
Yeah.
you almost don't see them.
Right.
But they can totally mess up the research if we aren't careful.
Exactly. Milner calls these pitfalls dangers.
Okay.
And he splits them into 3 categories.
3.
Yeah. And he doesn't just focus on, the obvious biases. He goes deeper into the hidden ones.
Interesting.
And even, unintended consequences that can happen.
Wow, so what are those categories?
Okay, so first, there are seen dangers.
Seen dangers.
Yeah, these are the blatant issues, like straight-up discrimination.
Okay, the obvious ones.
Right, things that are pretty much universally acknowledged as problems.
Got it.
But then it gets more interesting. He talks about unseen dangers.
Unseen.
Yeah, these are the hidden biases, the assumptions we all have, but might not even realize.
That's tricky.
It is. They can sneak into research without us knowing.
So a researcher might not even know these unseen dangers are there.
Exactly, let alone how to deal with them.
Right, and the impact can be huge. Imagine a study looking at student experiences in a school,
Okay.
and a student of color says they faced racism,
Uh-huh.
but the researcher dismisses it like they're playing the race card.
Oh, wow.
That's a classic unseen danger.
It's like the researchers trying to be colorblind, but they're actually shutting down an important voice.
And probably making those inequalities worse.
Which is the opposite of what they should be doing.
Makes you think, even with good intentions.
Researchers can still fall into these traps.
Are there other examples of unseen dangers in research?
Oh, definitely.
Like what?
Think about research on school discipline policies.
Okay.
If researchers don't consider racial differences, they might think some groups of students just misbehave more. instead of thinking about systemic bias.
Exactly, and that leads to the third danger.
Unforeseen dangers.
Unforeseen, right?
Yeah. These are the consequences that pop up
Okay.
when we don't think about race and culture in research.
The stuff we don't expect.
Right. But they can have a lasting bad impact.
Give me an example.
Okay. Say you're researching a new reading program,
Okay.
but you don't consider that some families might not have books at home.
I see.
The results could be misleading.
You might think the program's bad when it's actually about resources.
Yeah, you're basically setting those kids up to fail.
And it reminds me of something else Milner talks about.
What's that?
Teacher education programs.
Okay.
He says a lot of teaching materials just assume future teachers are white.
Oh, wow.
It might seem small, but it's a big unforeseen danger.
How so?
You're not preparing teachers to work with diverse students,
And that just continues the cycle.
where diverse voices are ignored in classrooms and research.
So these unforeseen dangers, they have a ripple effect.
Way beyond the initial research.
That's pretty worrying.
It is. It shows why we need to be so thoughtful about how we do research.
Especially in education, it's so important.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about these three types of dangers: seen, unseen, and unforeseen.
Right?
And it's clear that ignoring race and culture can cause some serious problems.
Yeah.
We're talking biased findings, even harmful consequences.
It's a lot to consider.
It is, but where do we go from here?
That's where Milner's framework comes in.
That's what we'll look at next.
He gives researchers a way to develop a deeper awareness of race and culture.
And this leads to better research.
More insightful, and more importantly, more equitable.
Okay, I'm really interested to hear more about this framework.
It's pretty groundbreaking stuff.
It sounds like it could change how we do research, especially in education.
It has that potential.
Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So we talked about the dangers, those pitfalls,
Right.
but now let's get to the solution.
Okay.
This framework Milner has, what's it all about? How does it help?
It's really smart. Breaks down into 4 parts.
4 parts.
Yeah, all about understanding race and culture in research.
Okay.
First part is researching the self.
Researching the self. I'm picturing like researchers looking at tiny versions of themselves.
Not quite.
Okay, what does it really mean then?
It's about researchers taking a hard look in the mirror
Okay.
at their own background, race, culture, all that.
So like how their background shapes how they see things.
Exactly, and how that affects their research.
Like we all have our own baggage, right?
Yeah, our own lens.
And that lens is shaped by our experiences, our background.
Cool.
It's not about judging ourselves, right?
No, it's about understanding
How our identity affects the research questions we ask.
the data we collect, even how we talk to participants.
That makes sense. But how do you actually do that?
Lots of ways. Reflection, journaling, talking to diverse people.
Okay.
The key is to be open, ready to learn and grow.
Got it. So you've looked at your own stuff.
Yeah.
What's next?
Part 2, researching the self in relation to others.
So now we're thinking about the baggage of the people we're studying.
It's more than just that.
Okay.
It's about understanding their perspectives, their experiences.
And acknowledging the power dynamics.
Exactly, because as researchers, we have a position of authority.
And that can affect how people respond to us, the data we get.
Absolutely, and if we don't see those power differences,
We risk falling into those unseen dangers.
we might misunderstand data, miss important viewpoints, even exploit people.
The second part, it's about empathy then.
Yeah, trying to understand each other, even when we're different.
But how do you actually cultivate empathy, practically?
It's about communication, listening, building real relationships.
Okay.
Seeing the research as a collaboration, everyone's voice matters.
That would make a big difference.
Sometimes it means using different research methods too.
Like what?
Storytelling, oral histories, things that make people comfortable.
I see. So we've explored ourselves. We've thought about the participants.
Right.
What's the third piece?
Engaged reflection and representation.
That sounds intense.
It's about making sure everyone is heard.
Everyone.
Researchers and participants talking together, reflecting.
So not just researchers taking information from people.
Exactly. It's a dialogue, so everyone feels represented in the findings.
Especially if there are different interpretations of the data.
Yeah, it helps avoid those unforeseen dangers.
I like this collaborative approach.
It gives a richer understanding, not just one dominant narrative.
Okay, on to the final part.
The fourth part is shifting from self to system.
Okay, shifting from self to system.
This is where we zoom out, look at the bigger picture.
Like taking off blinders.
Yeah, seeing the history, the politics, the social forces.
That affect the research.
It's like realizing your experience is just one tiny piece.
of a much bigger puzzle.
And we need to see the whole puzzle to understand anything.
So it's about acknowledging those bigger systems,
Power, privilege that shape our experiences.
both as researchers and participants.
We need to ask, how do these forces affect our research?
The questions we ask, the conclusions we make,
Everything.
that's really important.
So Milner is saying, reflect on your biases, understand your participants.
Engage in reflection together and see the bigger picture.
It's a whole package.
It's a lot, but how does it actually work in real research?
Milner gives this great example, a classroom interaction.
Oh, tell me about it. Okay, so what happens in this classroom?
So Milner describes this scene, right?
Yeah.
There's a teacher, Irene Washington,
Okay.
and she tells her student Darius,
Uh-huh.
"That's enough of your nonsense, Darius.
Oh, wow.
Your story doesn't make sense.
Okay,
I told you time and time again to stick to the theme."
so she's being pretty strict.
"Yeah, now sit down," she says.
And how does Darius react?
He goes back to his seat, looking upset.
Yeah, I can see why.
It does sound harsh.
A researcher might see that and judge the teacher right away.
Totally. They might think Irene is insensitive, not listening to Darius.
Especially if they believe in, like, student-centered learning.
Right, where creativity is important.
They might think Irene needs training,
In culturally responsive teaching?
Yeah, being aware of students' background.
But Milner wants us to think about other interpretations.
There might be more to it.
Exactly. He points out that Irene, she's experienced
Okay.
African-American educator, years working with kids like Darius.
So she knows what she's doing.
She might say, her approach comes from a place of care.
She understands the challenges they face.
Right? She might say, look, I know what these kids need.
To succeed, not just in school, but in life.
Sometimes you got to be firm, set high expectations,
Make sure they have the skills to navigate the world.
which might not always be fair.
That's a good point. It's not just about controlling Darius.
It's about preparing him.
Researchers need to go deeper, see the cultural nuances.
Exactly. This is where engaged reflection and representation matters.
Talking to the teacher, listening to her side.
You'd get a much better understanding.
I see how this framework helps researchers avoid those pitfalls.
Those dangers of misinterpreting things, making wrong conclusions.
Research is complicated.
It's not always black and white.
We need to think about our own biases.
And the bigger social context.
Okay, we've covered a lot today, race and culture in research.
Milner gave us a lot to think about.
Especially in education, and this framework is so helpful.
It can help anyone, really, trying to understand the world.
It's about challenging our assumptions, listening to others.
Thinking about the systems that shape us.
Be more aware, reflective, have open conversations.
If we want to make real change.
It's about recognizing complexity, being humble, willing to learn.
It's a call to action, move beyond simple explanations.
Grapple with race and culture in everything we do. So, how might we look at past research differently now?
What new questions do we have about research today?
It's something for all of us to think about.
As we keep learning and understanding,
And by using this framework,
we can do better research that helps everyone,